Number 1. Laser tag. This happened when I was 14 years old, and I'll never forget it. It still sort of haunts me to this day. Although I lived in town, I had a friend who lived in the country when I was in school. I'd been over to his house a few times, and always envied him in a way. He lived further away from most people, and I thought that he probably enjoyed it much better. He was far from anyone, and the house that he lived in was just great. His dad was a carpenter, and I guess he had greatly built it himself, but it was an amazing house. It had plenty of rooms, and was a lot more modern looking than many of the older houses in town. The friend, Eric, even had a satellite dish. This was a pretty big deal back in the day, and it was one of those really huge dishes you might have seen. Nothing like the small DirecTV ones that are around now. Plus you could get all sorts of channels from all over the world, which was really cool. Hanging out at Eric's was always a really fun thing to do. When I was 14 years old, Eric decided to have a sleepover at his house all weekend after school. This was going to be exceptionally fun because his parents were not going to be home all day on Saturday, so the 5 of us, the 4 friends and Eric, would have the run of the place for the entire day. For a few 14-year-old boys, having a house out in the country all to yourself was definitely something to look forward to. We had a pretty good time on Friday night. We just watched movies and had pizza, and we also played some video games. This happened quite a while back in the original Nintendo Entertainment System days, but it was still pretty exciting to us. However, by Saturday, when we were all left alone in the house, we were itching for something else to do. Eric had a lot of laser tag equipment that we often played with. If you aren't familiar with that, it's a game where everyone wears a sensor, and you carry a laser gun. If you fire the gun in the right spot, it sets off the sensor, and that person is then out of the game. We had played it very often, but a few of us were looking to try something different than what we usually did. All of us visiting thought it would be fun to go out into the woods and do the laser tag game, much like a game of hide and seek. There was so much woods out there that it would be a whole new world to hide in, so we could play a game that would last for hours if we did it right. The only problem is that Eric's parents didn't like him or his friends heading out into the hills like that. They didn't own the property that surrounded the house, although Eric's dad did know who did. So first off, going into the woods would be trespassing. They were also worried that there might be dangerous animals out there, and there was also the possibility of getting lost. But with them being gone all day, there was really nothing to worry about. The parents wouldn't return until the following morning, so as long as no one stepped in a bear trap or got tangled up in barbed wire, we figured we would be okay. We really had a fun time out in the woods. We could hang out in a tree to attack each other, hide behind rocks, or even just lay on the ground and cover ourselves up in leaves. Since it was fall, the leaves had been falling pretty heavily, so there was a lot of them to work with. We kept up playing the game a lot and eventually lost track of time. It didn't matter though, because we were just having such a great time. It was sometime in the late afternoon that something odd happened. We were playing around and everyone had been found, except for my friend Rodney. Eric was it, and we weren't supposed to help him find Rodney. However, after a bit of time searching for him, we began to think that he must have chosen way too good of a hiding place. So all 4 of us openly began searching for him. We also tried calling for him, letting him know that he was safe because he had found such a good spot. This was a way of trying to entice him to come out of hiding, but it didn't work. We were at first under the impression that Rodney was trying to just milk out his good hiding skills for as long as possible. We certainly didn't think that something may have happened to him. However, as we looked around for him more, and he didn't run out and yell "surprise" at us, we began thinking something bad may have happened. He could have fallen and broken something or been knocked out. As far as we knew, there could have been a dangerous snake out there, and he could have gotten bit. There was just a whole lot of things that we didn't know, but we were pretty sure that we would find him. Our confidence went down significantly when we noticed the light was beginning to go away. Eric had never been out in the woods before like this, so we couldn't count on him knowing his way around to help us find Rodney. It was going to be even worse once we didn't have any light, so we redoubled our efforts, but we began to get very worried about it. We sent Eric back to the house to get some flashlights while we continued looking. We didn't think of how stupid it was to try splitting up, especially when it began to get dark outside, but we weren't thinking rationally at that point. A friend of ours was literally missing, while we were out doing something that we were never supposed to be doing. If we didn't find him, who knows what could happen to the guy. And to a lesser extent, we were also pretty worried about what was going to happen to us either way. Eric got back with the flashlights, and we continued to look for Rodney after the sun went completely down. It was very difficult doing so, of course, without being able to see very far ahead of us. And it was scary enough without it being dark, but it was more so with us being in the dark and being alone. Every step was terrifying, especially when you consider the imagination of a 14-year-old boy trying to imagine what the different reasons that Rodney may have disappeared. Suddenly I heard one of the other guys screaming. I couldn't figure out just based off the sound who it was though, but I could tell the direction that it was coming from. I immediately began running as fast as I could in that direction. After a while I was able to hear and eventually see my other friends running towards the scream too. I figured that it was our buddy Adam who had screamed, and I noticed him running toward us. We stopped Adam from running because we wanted him to explain to us why he had screamed. He was utterly terrified, however. He didn't want to talk, and he just kept wanting to run off toward the house. We couldn't reason with him. This boy was seriously scared to death. So Eric, I, and the third boy, Lonnie, agreed to let him go back to the house, and we would continue to look around for Rodney. We kept looking, and I don't really know how long we were out there. However, there had to be a point when we realized that things weren't going to be going our way, and that we needed to get some adults involved in the search. And that is when the three of us gave up the search and headed back to the house. Once we were there, Eric called the police and let them know that Rodney had disappeared several hours ago, and that we hadn't been able to find him at all. It was only when the police had gotten there that we realized what had scared Adam. He had seen a guy out there in the woods, a huge, scary-looking guy. The guy had rushed towards him when he saw Adam, and that was what scared the boy so much. Based on Adam's description of the scary guy, I had a pretty good idea who it was. There was an old man who lived in a shack further up in the hills. He was basically a hermit, and didn't have much contact with other people. When Adam saw the guy, he confirmed that it was the man that he had seen rushing him. And that was a new fear for me, Eric, and Lonnie, because after Adam had fled, we still had been out there in the dark with that scary man. There was also no doubt in any of our minds that he had something to do with Rodney's disappearance. The man was never charged with anything, however. Rodney was never found, so there was no real evidence that he was kidnapped or killed or anything like that. All searches turned up absolutely nothing. It was eventually decided that Rodney had run away from home, and he had used the laser tag game as a way to stage his disappearance. That never sat quite well with me, however. I mean, it didn't make sense, because he would have had to decide to run away that day, since we had only decided to play the game that day. But with no body or remains ever being found, it was the only explanation for what could have happened to him. Number 2, Creek. I really liked going out with my cousins along the creek in order to skip rocks. The only issue was that we had to walk along the stream for quite a long time until we came to the part of the creek that was wide enough as a pond. That was the place where the creek was surrounded by rocks that we could use to skip them across the creek. So it was quite a walk, but we went out and did it all the time. I think we might have been 12 on that fall day that we decided to go to the creek to skip rocks, or maybe to try and collect some salamanders. I will firstly always remember the day because it felt like the first real day of fall that year. Not only were the leaves falling from the trees as if it were raining outside, but it had gotten chilly for the first time that year. I remember being told that we had to put on our jackets if we were going out. The day was going along pretty much like any other day, with us going out to the creek. One of my cousins had brought a jar that he used to try and catch salamanders into. Out of the three of us, he kept falling behind as we walked along the creek. Once we got to the large part of the creek, that cousin kept on looking for salamanders, but wasn't having any luck with it. Looking back, I wonder if that might have had something to do with the weather, but I didn't know for sure. The other two of us kept finding rocks and skipping them, trying to see who could get the most skips. We did that back and forth for a while, nothing really out of the ordinary happening. But then, off ahead of the creek, we saw something we hadn't expected. There was a man of some sorts walking up to the creek. He was on the other side of where we were, and once he noticed us, he started moving even faster up to the creek. The man looked like some old hillbilly you would see in a movie, and not the sort of person any of us were used to seeing in real life. He looked ragged and dirty, and as he got closer we noticed he had a really scraggly and long, unkempt beard. He was really sort of creepy looking, but we likely didn't give that very much mind at the time. The guy walked over to the thinner and more shallow part of the creek and then crossed over. He was obviously trying to come and get over to us, and then to do something. We were somewhat guarded, but still not worried. 12-year-old boys often have a whole lot of bravado, and we didn't think that we had anything to be scared of. When the guy got closer to us, we realized just how disgusting he really was. I mean, he took being a hobo to a whole new level. He didn't have any teeth, and he smelled worse than anything that I had ever smelled thus far at that age. All in all, we really didn't know how to react to him, other than being somewhat cautious. The old man told us in the scariest old voice that we'd ever heard that he wanted to show us something. He kept motioning over to the way that he had come from. He tried to convince us to follow him, to see what it was, and then turned and started walking off. Turning around, after noticing that we hadn't followed him, the guy looked pretty confused. He stepped back toward us and tried to get us to follow him again. He kept going on and on about having something that he wanted to show us, but we wouldn't get to see it if we didn't hurry up and follow him. It wouldn't last there forever. When we didn't react, he walked over to my cousin Jimmy. Jimmy was the one who was looking for the salamanders. The hobo grabbed him by the arm and began pulling him. He kept on going on and on about wanting to show us something. But by that point, there wasn't a whole lot of what he was saying that any of us could make out. Plus, once he had gotten a hold on Jimmy, we weren't paying attention to what he had to say anymore. We were just worried about our cousin being in trouble. Jimmy was definitely scared. He began yelling and struggling and trying to get away from the scary guy. However, the guy had a firm grip on him and wasn't about to let go. He succeeded dragging Jimmy a few feet quickly before the other two of us had even a chance to react. Once we were able to react, my other cousin and I picked up the rocks that we were skipping. We started throwing them at the man, who had a grip on our cousin. Several rocks hit him, but he didn't let go until I threw a sharp one, just like I was skipping it. It hit the old guy in the forehead, and he fell over, and let go of Jimmy. Jimmy immediately ran over to the other two of us. The man got up, this time sounding very angry. When we were able to see his face, we could tell that the rock really cut into his face deeply. He was bleeding pretty badly, and we could also tell how angry he was because he began yelling at us, and then he started stumbling toward us, but nearly fell down a couple of times. We didn't need to even talk about it. The three of us began running as fast as we could, and we didn't look back at all. We didn't want to see how close that scary old guy was to catching us. It was scary enough thinking about it, and we didn't look back even once before we got back to the dirt road that led back to my house. And when we did, we didn't see him anywhere. We were honestly so scared that we didn't even tell my parents what had happened. Being young boys, we thought, if we just didn't talk about it, we could make it seem like it never happened. Naive, I know, but no one ever found out. My family never knew what happened, and we never found out what happened to the old guy. But also, we never felt bad about it either. I mean, if he hadn't taken hold of Jimmy the way that he did, we wouldn't have hit him with the rocks. So we never blamed anyone but him, but still hoped we didn't severely injure the man. Number 3. House. The very first time I ever lived out in the country happened when I was 13 years old. My parents were going through a particularly nasty divorce, and they were doing their best to limit my exposure to the whole thing. I suppose that in retrospect, it was the one good thing that came out of the divorce. They were trying to show me some love and consideration. So I went to stay with my aunt out in the country. She was a very nice lady who was married to a really great guy. They also had a great son too. So I enjoyed being there, even though it was a bit of a culture shock to me. I was so used to living in a suburban area that was nothing like the area that they lived in. Where I was used to living somewhere with a whole lot of people constantly around, it was different living in an area like that. If you sat on the porch all day, there might be 1 or 2 trucks or cars driving down the road that you could wave your hands at, but that was really about it. My cousin Brian and I, most of our interactions with other people was us simply interacting with each other. The house that was the closest to my aunt's house was this big Victorian-looking house. It was completely out of place with all the other houses in the area. I suppose that made sense, as it was supposedly much older. Also, according to Brian and his parents, the house was abandoned, and had been sitting empty as long as they had known about it. It did obviously look like it was abandoned, and we never saw anyone there. But Brian and I used to go down and out, and do some stuff during the day, and one evening, while we were walking home, we walked by the big old house. When we did, we noticed that there was smoke coming from the chimney. It seemed really strange to us, and we mentioned it to my aunt and uncle when we got home. They, however, said that it wasn't unusual. Whoever owned the house probably came by every now and then and lit the wood-burning stove to keep the house from getting moldy or something like that. I can't remember what their exact reasoning was. However, the next night, we noticed the smoke coming from the chimney again. We thought it was weird that we would see it 2 nights in a row if what my aunt had told us was correct. But this time we didn't mention it to her when we got home. The 2 of us just talked about it amongst ourselves, and we came up with a lot of silly stories between the 2 of us about why it could have been like that. But we didn't take any of it seriously, and it was simply just something that we found interesting to talk about. I didn't think about it until a few days later on when Brian and I had been outside again. We had walked by, and we noticed the smoke again, so we decided that we should go up to the house and check it out. It was odd, and we hadn't considered it until that point. There was no vehicle in the driveway, so we wanted to get close enough to the house to figure out what was going on. Brian and I got up to the porch, and we suddenly heard the sound of a woman screaming, and she was screaming out in bloody terror, as if she was being murdered. Brian and I got scared, and then we ran off to the road. We then ran home as quickly as possible, and when we got there, we told my uncle what we had experienced. And he went off to check it out, while my aunt called the police. It was a while before my uncle got back to us, but when he did, he said that there was no one at the house. There was no indication that there was anyone there, much less any evidence of anyone being attacked there. And finally, the wood-burning stove was completely cold, and there was no indication that it had been used any time recently. There was literally no physical evidence of all of the things that Brian and I had witnessed. My aunt and uncle did not accuse us of lying. They believed that we experienced everything that we said that we did, but they just assumed there was another explanation, perhaps even something supernatural. So we didn't get in trouble for lying, and to this day, Brian and I will both confirm that we didn't make this up. We saw the smoke and heard the scream, but there was never evidence that any of it happened. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.